sitting in for him for introducing Dr. Shaviro today. Dr. Shaviro received his PhD in English Literature from Yale University in 1981. He taught at the University of Washington from 1984 to 2004. Since 2004, he's been the DeRoy Professor of English at Wayne State. His books include Connected, or What It Means to Live in the Network Society Without Criteria, Whitehead, Deleuze, and Aesthetics, The Universe of Things on Speculative Realism, Post-Cinematic Affect, Discognition, and Digital Music Videos, among others. He teaches a wide variety of film and media classes for the Department of English, ranging from Introduction to Film and Media Theory, to Classical Hollywood. Today, Steve will be giving a Brownback presentation on Speculative Time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn, and thanks to everybody for coming. Okay, so I won't get to the slides until later, but that's, I think, a good illustration of what I'm trying to do. Okay, sorry. Okay, basically what I'm doing today, in the past, whenever I've doing a Humanities Center talk, I've done a finished project, so something I've already written. I'm taking a kind of opposite approach today, since this is basically a book project that just really started, and which won't be done until, speaking optimistically, 3 to 5 years. Okay, so I do have a kind of an outline and stuff like that. And my original thought was to, let me turn off the ringing on my phone, because now that I'm about to turn 65, I get like 2 calls at trying to get me involved in various scams about healthcare literally every day, Monday through Friday. Okay, so that won't interrupt. Okay, so I have a kind of outline, and my first thought was to sort of talk through an outline of the book, but then I started writing what will hopefully be the introduction, so I thought it might be better to read that instead, which gives some kind of general overview. Unfortunately, I haven't finished writing the introduction, so at some point I'll just have to stop reading and instead just sort of talk my way through the rest of it. And depending on time, I'll read what I have actually written out, and after that, I have a few slides which give some background, flesh out some of the stuff I want to do later in the book proper. Okay, so I teach film and media studies, but I do a lot of work on science fiction, and that's usually written science fiction or science fiction literature as opposed to science fiction film. So that's mostly what I'm talking about here. So, okay, given that, I'll just start reading, okay. Speculative Time is a book about science fiction and futurity. It explores the temporal orientation of science fiction, the fact that it's set in a future rather than the present or the past. This is not a matter of grammar. Most science fiction stories are narrated in the past tense or the present tense, just like other sorts of written narratives. Nor is it a matter of formal innovation. Most science fiction stories are straightforwardly representational or referential, in the same way that traditional naturalistic fiction tends to be. It is just that science fiction, with its future orientation, refers to different sorts of things than other fictional prose narratives. By saying that science fiction stories are representational or referential, I'm going against the prevailing understanding of science fiction in academia, canonically articulated by Darko Suvin as the literature of cognitive estrangement. While I do not contest the importance of either science fiction texts, either cognition or estrangement in science fiction, I still insist that science fiction texts are representational ones because they display a fundamental aboutness. They have external content. They do not predominantly focus, as high modernist works are often said to do, upon the medium of their own craft, so the expression matters more than what is being expressed. That's a quote from Clement Greenberg, one of the most prominent art critics of the mid-later 20th century. Okay. It is true that some brilliant new wave science fiction of the 1960s and 1970s sought to emulate the self-conscious narrative strategies of 20th century modernist and avant-garde literature, but even the most explicitly experimental, formally audacious science fiction texts, and I'd name here, for instance, Samuel Delaney's Dahlgren, 1975, and J.G. Ballard's Atrocity Exhibition, 1970. Even these works nonetheless remain basically referential. Formal innovation still works in the service of an explicit external content. You might say that science fiction is more in common, to give an art world or a visual art comparison, it is more in common with the figurative art of Jack Kirby than it does with the self-reflexive abstractions of Kirby's near contemporary Jackson Pollock. For the most part, science fiction narratives overtly claim to depict or to illustrate a world that exists in its own right, beyond the limits of the text. This remains the case even though the world so depicted diverges sharply from the one in which we live and indeed does not actually exist. Science fiction shares this quality of aboutness with other genres of popular narrative fiction. These genres are all predominantly referential, even if the particular events to which they refer do not actually happen. Samuel Delany explains the difference between science fiction and other sorts of referential genre fictions in terms of their different levels of subjunctivity. This again is not a matter of grammar, the actual use of verbs in the subjunctive mood, but rather of the discourse's overall level of possibility. Science fiction, Delany writes, concerns events that have not happened, at least so far. And such events, another quote, are very different from the naturalistic fictional events that could have happened, or the fantastic events that could not have happened. Delany's observation can be restated in terms of the worlds in which fictional events take place. Naturalistic fiction places its imaginary characters and events in the context of something like the familiar world in which the writer and the readers actually live, or in which their historical predecessors lived. On the other hand, non-naturalistic or fantastic genres, including but not limited to science fiction, depart from the actual world as presumed context. They engage instead in building alternative worlds within which their characters live and the events they describe take place. These alternative worlds differ from the world we know in at least some respects, though they usually retain enough features of actuality to make them at least partly recognizable. Depending on the sort of fiction in question, these alternative worlds may involve counterfactual historical sequences, as well as entirely fantastic locales and physically impossible happenings. Science fiction differs from other fantastic genres in the alternative world to which it refers as a future world, one that postdates, extends beyond, and departs from, but therefore also to a certain extent arises out of the actual world in which it is written. In defining science fiction in terms of its future orientation, I am of course sidestepping a lot of major problems. There are all sorts of difficulties. First, difficulties with the identification and circumscription of science fiction as a particular genre. Two of the best current science fiction critics, Cheryl Vint and Mark Bold, have in fact written an article called Science Fiction Does Not Exist. Second, there's a problem with the broader question of what is entailed when we try to define genres at all, whether genres of text or genres of cultural objects more broadly. And third, with the fact that science fictional tropes and story elements have recently spread over so many media, from prose fiction to movies to music, that science fiction would better be understood as a mode of discourse rather than as a genre with its particular forms and protocols. Indeed, we live at a time when, as Donna Haraway famously puts it, the boundary between science fiction and social reality is an optical illusion. Such ubiquity makes it hard to circumscribe any definition. Now, I'm less interested in engaging in these debates, however, than in explaining why I continue to speak of science fiction at all. I'm perfectly aware that genre designations like science fiction cannot be made rigorous and precise. It's always possible to find ambiguous cases, exceptions, and counterexamples that undermine whatever definition has been proposed. At best, genre definitions are fuzzy concepts like what Wittgenstein calls family resemblances. These are loose categories for grouping objects that, like members of an extended family, Wittgenstein says, have no one thing in common but display many different kinds of affinity between them. This has been cited in relation to science fiction a number of times in recent years. What's more, even when genre definitions are made in this rough and imprecise way, they are historically variable, so that their meanings and contents change over the course of time. As John Reeder puts it, and Reeder has written the definitive account of the genre politics and genre meanings of science fiction as a genre. As Reeder puts it, Frankenstein was not a science fiction novel when it was initially published in 1818, but today it is a science fiction novel. Conversely, critics have suggested that given our current designations of science fiction, much older texts, like Lucian's True History, 160 AD, and Cyrano de Bergerac's Voyage to the Moon, 1657 AD, should also be retrospectively counted as science fiction. And finally, genre designations cannot just refer to the intrinsic characteristics of texts or other cultural artifacts in themselves, because such designations also encompass, indeed they are generated and inflected by, the many practices and activities that surround and receive them, from marketing strategies to fan activities to scholarly research projects. And again, there's been a lot of interest in writing on this recently. what makes a text be considered science fiction has a lot to do with whether science fiction fans, science fiction conventions, science fiction magazines, things like that. Nonetheless, genre designations like science fiction can still be useful and valuable as long as we keep their fuzziness and contingency in mind. Indeed, it's scarcely possible to speak intelligibly about individual cultural artifacts without taking questions of genre into consideration. No such object is so unique that it doesn't in some sense belong to one genre or another, and often to several at once. Genre designations have at the very least a strong heuristic value. They help us to determine how any particular work or cultural object is related to others, as well as how it fits into, which is also to say how it diverges from, a broader range of aesthetic, commercial, and historical contexts. A term like science fiction, therefore, is as indispensable as it is ultimately indefensible. We may say about genre designations what Alfred North Whitehead says more generally about abstractions. Whitehead writes, "You cannot think without abstractions. Accordingly, it is the utmost importance to be vigilant in critically revising your modes of abstraction." That is to say, we have to use abstractions in order to get anywhere at all, in order to think at all. But for this very reason, we always need to be vigilantly aware of the flaws and limitations of our abstractions. Without some process of abstraction, or what Whitehead also calls imaginative generalization, we can never get beyond the rigid empiricism of simply describing isolated instances. At the same time, however, Whitehead warns us that every abstraction is also a simplification and therefore a falsification. It involves throwing out whatever data are not relevant to our immediate purposes. To assert the similarity of multiple items is ipso facto to ignore the ways in which they are different from one another. To establish categories of any sort is to willfully ignore anomalies and counterexamples. We're therefore always in danger of taking our abstractions to be more precise and comprehensive than they actually are. This is what Whitehead calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. In what follows, I will strive to remain cognizant of the limits of my categories and terms, even as I continue to use them. Making all these allowances, my basic thesis is still that science fiction is about futurity. I want to give futurity a particular resonance, distinguishing it from any more general sense of the future. Just as naturalistic fiction recounts events that could happen in the world as it exists in the present moment, even though they have not actually happened, so science fiction recounts events that could only happen at some moment in the future, but without claiming that they actually will happen. Science fiction envisions a futurity that never becomes present, never actually comes to pass. Far from claiming to predict the future, therefore, science fiction, for the most part, vehemently rejects any such ambition. As the science fiction novelist Warren Ellis puts it, "When I'm working and talking in the sphere of futurism, I try never to do predictions, same as science fiction writer. Speculation and fabulation is what I do, and it should never be treated as prediction. Prediction is a con game and a clown show." In other words, what I am calling futurity is not the same thing as the actual future. Futurity is not something that will happen a minute or a week or a million years from now. Rather, futurity always retains its subjectivity. It is something that could happen, something that could emerge or develop from the world as we live in it now, but it is never something that actually does happen. Futurity in its very nature is always unrealized and unfulfilled. It is a perpetual not yet. It is also unavoidably vague and plural, a cluster of possibilities rather than a single determination. Futurity is therefore a kind of opening, an incipience, an inflection, a nuance, a latency, a tendency. It is not part of any actual situation, but it is implicit in actual situations, even the ones that seem most closed and complete in themselves. I will encounter wisps of futurity in the form of intimations, premonitions, and anticipations. But these are not just subjunctive fantasies. They are not just my own imaginative projections. Rather, futurity is already a hidden dimension of things themselves. Every worldly situation bristles with potentialities, even if these are never actualized or fulfilled. It is often said that science fiction is really about the present moment in which it is written, rather than the future time in which it is set. I'm trying to suggest that these are not mutually exclusive alternatives. To say that science fiction is about futurity is to say that it envisions potentialities rather than actualities. But these potentialities do in fact exist today at the present moment. They are fully real in their own right. It's just that their existence does not take the form of actual states of affairs. Rather, these futurities exist precisely as potentialities or anticipations. They're not directly apprehensible, but we can sense them by their effects as they deform the present moment, pulling the current situation outside of and beyond itself. As Richard Gruson puts it, the present possible futures envisioned by something like science fiction have real effects in the present, even before they've happened. Or in the words of one of the most interesting contemporary science fiction writer, the black quantum futurist Rashida Phillips, this is a quote from her, "The future, both near and far, impacts the present, now, reaching back to meet the past and create our experiences of the present." End of quote. If the past still lingers in the present, and think of Faulkner saying the past isn't dead, it isn't even really past, then futurity already haunts the present, even before it arrives and even if it never does. In order to draw out these penumbral futurities and make them more explicit, science fiction engages in thought experiments. This is more than just a vague analogy with science. Science fictional thought experiments, much like actual experience in physical science, take place in closed artificial situations. An experimental setup can be described as a simplified model of the world, the abstraction from experience of which Whitehead writes. Within such an artificial abstract situation, it becomes possible to isolate particular processes or tendencies. These are vectors pointing towards possible futures. As the philosopher Roy Bhaskar puts it in his account of the workings of physical science, this is a quote from Bhaskar, "An experiment may now be understood quite simply as an attempt to trigger or unleash a single kind of mechanism or process in relative isolation, free from the interfering flux of the open world, so as to observe its detailed workings or record its characteristic mode of effect and or to test some hypothesis about it." End of quote. The processes or tendencies discovered in the course of scientific experimentation are themselves objectively real features of the world. They are not just anthropocentric projections. But without the relative isolation and closure of the experimental setup, an artificial situation devised by scientists, we might not be able to notice these processes or tendencies and pick them out, for they're easily masked and swamped by the, to quote Bhaskar again, the interfering flux of the open world, which I take to be very similar to what systems theorists call noise, which interferes with any signal. Science fiction narratives operate according to a similar dynamic. Much like actual scientific experiments, they're devised to be focused and limited in scope. A certain degree of artificial closure is required in order to work through specific tensions and pick out their implicit futurities. This limitation usually takes the form of more or less closed narratives. A science fiction story posits particular circumstances and processes that are focused through the experiences of particular characters. What might happen, for instance, if Portia spiders, already known to be among the most intelligent invertebrates, had their intelligence boosted to human levels by genetic manipulation? That's this kind of core situation in Adrian Tchaikovsky's 2015 novel, Children of Time. Or to get a more down-to-earth example, how might New Yorkers adapt to the heightened sea levels and flooding of much of the city that are likely to result from global warming, which is the subject of Kim Stanley Robinson's recent novel, New York 2140. Those are just examples. Science fictional thought experiments are not quantifiable, of course, in the manner that actual experiments in physical science are. But this is what allows science fictional experiments to be open or audacious and to include, let's say, more noise and incoherence than strictly physical experiments are able to handle. So for me, it's always a balance between getting rid of the noise so you can discern a pattern and allowing in more noise so you can see more complex patterns or more complex models of what can go on. The great and now seemingly forgotten literary critic Morse Peckham remarks that, and this is a quote from Peckham, "The arts are analogous to the scientific laboratory because of the ways that the arts offer rehearsal in the perception and toleration of categorical incoherence, a training in sustained problem exposure, behavior necessary as preliminary to the resolution of categorical incoherence." So I could say a lot more about Peckham, which I won't here, but basically he's saying, it's a negotiation between the categorical incoherence of the fact that the world exceeds whatever categories or abstractions we apply to it, and an effort to somehow be able to make categories fit together in some way so that we can actually figure things out and do things. And Peckham is talking about literature in general, but I think what he says is especially true for science fiction because directly concerned as it is with sustained problem exposure in unknown and unexpected situations. Even as it remains limited in scope, science fiction works explicitly and overtly with a high level of categorical incoherence, arguably higher than that of other fictional genres. It de-emphasizes the taken for granted assumptions of the present moments in order to explore the changes, instabilities, and transformations of futurity. The problem for every work of science fiction is to tolerate as much categorical incoherence as possible, while at the same time sufficiently delineating the scope of the thought experiment and of the alternative world in which it takes place so that some sort of resolution is still attainable. In other words, to quote another philosopher who's written about science fiction, Isabel Stengers, the art of the thought experiment involves unfolding the consequences of a daring hypothesis. A strong initial supposition is necessary, as well as both care and imagination in working it through and considering how lives might be changed by it. A successful science fiction narrative, Stengers says, engages in, and this is another quote from her, the exploration of effects. It envisions a future world that is dense with the repercussions and consequences of its hypothesis. a world whose inhabitants live with the opportunities, problems, dilemmas, habits, hopes, and fears the hypothesis makes possible but does not explain. As science fiction works through these repercussions and consequences, it evokes futurity, but without ever making anything like actual predictions. And this has to do with what I say that what you're saying, what the hypothesis makes certain things possible, but it does not explain them. It's not a total necessary condition it's a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition for these hopes and fears, habits, etc. That is to say, science fiction is non-deterministic. It's concerned with the range of outcomes that a new social or technological development makes possible, but without maintaining that the development in question can necessitate or even explain any particular outcome. The most common and most commonly cited methods of science fictional thought experiments are extrapolation, speculation, and fabulation. Warren Ellis lays claim to the second and third of these in the passage I quoted above, while he rejects the con game of actual prediction. And in a recent essay, the critic Brooks Landon gives a concise history of the intertwined uses of the first and seconds, extrapolation and speculation, in science fiction and in thinking about science fiction. Even though, perhaps because these terms have been so widely used, there's no settled consensus on what any of them means or in how they are related. Some writers distinguish sharply between them, while others take them as more or less synonymous. After tracing the various uses, Landon goes so far as to suggest that, I quote, historically freighted and fraught terms such as extrapolation and speculation may have well reached the end of their usefulness for understanding science fiction today. Nonetheless, it's not easy, for me, it doesn't seem easy to do without these terms when contemplating science fiction. Like the concept of science fiction itself, so the concept of extrapolation, speculation, and fabulation do important work despite their lack of ultimate justification or even of consistency across the time that they have been used. Let me try to circumcise the ways that I'm using these three terms here, which is a bit arbitrary. It doesn't claim to be representative, but it's the way I find useful to think of these terms. I see them in a sequence involving increasing degrees of projection and invention. Start with another quote from Landon. Extrapolation is a widely used mathematical term that denotes precision and extension from the known to the unknown, while speculation is a widely used financial term with connotations of risk, lack of firm evidence, and uncertainty. Okay, so starting with extrapolation, most literally it refers to mathematical modeling. We extrapolate when on a graph we extend a straight line or continue the direction of a curve. Extrapolation is fundamentally probabilistic. It depends upon an assumption of continuity, or what Whitehead calls the conformity of the present to the past through a historic route of actual occasions. Barring outside interference, we expect that a trend or process will continue to unfold in the same manner as it has already done up to the present moment. Of course, we know that this is not always an accurate assumption. Extrinsic factors intervene so that disruptions can do occur once we step outside the artificial closure of the experimental situation. In addition, even in the absence of outside interference, many processes are not linear. They reach inflection points or singularities after which they cease to behave as they previously did. For instance, to give an obvious, simple example, under certain conditions, water ceases to flow and either boils or freezes instead. The best science fictional extrapolations are fully aware of this pitfall. To extend particular events and tendencies, to accelerate and intensify them, can also mean to follow them all the way to and even beyond the singular points at which they break down. This is when they show qualitative changes and mutate into strange new forms. Extrapolation thus works to reveal the implicit and hidden potentialities of social and technological processes. Marshall and Eric McLuhan suggest that any new technology or medium, when pushed to the limits of its potential, quote, sets off a kind of chain reaction in the way that it does certain things. The McLuhans say that a new medium will enhance, obsolesce, retrieve, and reverse into yet other technologies and media. The point of science with fictional extrapolation is to explore and to unfold these sorts of cascading transformations. For instance, in the 1960s and 1970s, John Brunner published 4 dystopian science fiction novels, each of which isolated and extrapolated from a few particular social trends. Stand on Zanzibar, 1968, deals with overpopulation. The Jagged Orbit, 1969, deals with racism, hyper-individualism, and the proliferation of assault weapons. The Sheep Look Up, 1972, deals with environmental pollution and degradation. And The Shockwave Rider, 1975, deals with massive data collection and with future shock, a term we got from Alvin and Heidi Toffler, meaning the disorienting social effects of rapid technological change. Brunner extrapolates these trends in a number of ways. He shows how they are produced, promoted, and accelerated by powerful corporations and elites. He uses modernist prose techniques to some extent in order to convey the effects of media amplification and saturation. He traces the ways that technological changes are correlated with social and cultural changes, and he narrates the mad proliferation of all these processes, how they give rise to grotesque and unintended consequences and ultimately push American society to the point of massive dysfunction and breakdown. Of course, Brunner did not predict the future with any sort of literal accuracy. The early 21st century societies he depicts in those novels are quite different from the one that we actually live in today. And although he anticipates the massive growth and ubiquitous extent of computation and communication in the early 21st century, most of the details he provides for these technologies seem rather clunky and old-fashioned from our current perspective. And if you read his descriptions of how computers work, and I mean, we don't have computer printers, so if you want to get an answer from a computer, you put in punch cards and get the answer out from a fax machine, basically. I mean, it's always interesting how science fiction predicts certain things and not others, but this goes back to what I mean by the difference between prediction, which science fiction doesn't really do, and representing futurity, which I think it does do when it works well. So the point is that even if Brunner got the future wrong, didn't predict, he got the futurities right. His novels envision prospects and potentialities that are still matters of deep concern for us today. These include poisoned oceans and mass extinction events, schizoid personality structures generated by and refracted through social media, resurgences of racism, weapons fetishism, and outbreaks of violence, and governmental and corporate surveillance invading all aspects of what used to be considered private life. Brunner extrapolates futurities that still menace us, if anything, more severely now than they did when his novels were written half a century ago. Brunner's future is not our actual present, but his anticipations, his futurities, are still to a real extent our own. Okay, on now to speculation. Speculation has broader horizons than extrapolation. It implies a freer flight, and here's some quotes, flight in the thin air of imaginative generalization, it's a quote from Whitehead. It implies a more concerted activity of proposing and testing what Isabel Steng was called daring hypotheses, and it assumes a greater openness to risk and uncertainty, as Landon says. This means that speculation picks up just at the point where extrapolation falters and fails. If extrapolation follows a social technological trend to the limits of its potential, as the McLuhan say, then speculation seeks to imagine what happens when a trend exceeds its potential and pushes against or beyond its own limits. Where extrapolation is grounded in probabilistic reasoning, speculation is rather concerned with possibilities, no matter how extreme or improbable they may be. As Rod Serling once said in his introduction to a 1962 episode of The Twilight Zone, science fiction is the improbable made possible. Now, the phrase speculative fiction is sometimes used as a synonym for science fiction. That's how it is originally used. At other times, and more recently, it designates a superset that also includes non-futuristic alternative world genres like fantasy and horror. But in either case, the narrower or the broader one, it's difficult to disentangle fictional speculation from its two near doppelgangers, philosophical speculation on the one hand and financial speculation on the other hand. Landon, as we have seen, regards speculation as a widely used financial term, but its philosophical use is extremely important. And this relates to what I was just saying, that speculation seeks to push beyond the limits. In the late 18th century, Immanuel Kant's critical philosophy sought to put an end to metaphysical speculation. We fall into delusion and dogmatism, Kant says, when we try to go beyond the limits within which our formulations alone have meaning and relevance. For instance, even a statement that is true for every particular entity in the universe, Kant says, is not true for the universe itself, since the point is precisely that the universe itself is not a particular entity. In the first half of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant demonstrates that our knowledge pertains only to appearances, not to things in themselves. And in the second half, he tracks down, catalogs, and refutes the various forms of speculative delusion that threaten to lead us astray. We cannot ever truly know things as they actually are in themselves, Kant says, apart from our impositions upon them. And we cannot ever hope to grasp the unity, the totality, or the comprehensive grounding of all existence. All these, according to Kant, lie beyond the boundaries of any possible understanding. Now, even as Kant warns us against these errors, however, he also acknowledges that the drive to speculation can never be eliminated, for it is, he says, a natural and unavoidable illusion. It's intrinsic to reason itself. Speculation is therefore an eternal, irresistible temptation. And indeed, ever since Kant, philosophers, from the German idealists of the early 19th century generation after him, all the way to the speculative realists of today, have again and again searched for loopholes that would allow them to overcome Kant's posing of limits and his restriction of knowledge to the empirical realm. But it's not really easy to restore the rights of speculation. Just as, according to Whitehead, any successful abstraction must pay the price of leaving certain details unaccounted for, So we might say that any speculative attempt to move beyond mere phenomena will find itself inevitably haunted by some sort of exception or remainder. As Whitehead himself puts it, what he calls every speculative scheme, including his own, necessarily falls short of its ambitions. And there's another quote from Whitehead. If we consider any scheme of philosophical categories, and Whitehead is explicitly including his own here, if we consider any such scheme as one complex assertion and apply to it the logician's alternative true or false, the answer must be that the scheme is false. The difference is that for Whitehead, unlike for Kant, this falsity is not the end of the matter. After all, Whitehead also notoriously proclaims that, one of my favorite quotes from him, it is more important that a proposition be interesting than that it be true. What does he mean by this? A proposition that is false when it fails, whether by error or by omission, to describe the world as it actually is. But if the false proposition be interesting enough, it may stimulate thought, either by making us aware of its own gaps and omissions, or else by suggesting potentials for difference, alternatives to what is actually the case. A good speculative proposition draws us down an unexpected path. It provides what Whitehead calls a lure for feeling. Without the lure of false propositions, we might never be moved to change anything. Speculation attracts us and unsettles us, encouraging us to think and act in ways that we might have done otherwise. In sum, even though speculation does not ever succeed in leading us to higher truths, it works in a positive manner by taking the form of fiction. Its import is aesthetic rather than epistemological. And so I think, in Kantian terms, you have to shift from the first critique to the third critique. And this is why speculation, I think, best takes the form of speculative fiction. Speculative fiction quickens our imaginations and envisions future ways of being that are different from that of the present and discontinuous with it. Pushing beyond mere extrapolation, speculation allows us, in the words of the contemporary speculative realist philosopher Graham Harman, to reach conclusions that seem counterintuitive or even downright strange. This is crucial, I would say, precisely because we can never know reality as a whole or real things as they actually are. Therefore, there is always, Harman says, a gap between reality and its explicit manifestations. The aesthetic appeal of speculation, which Whitehead refers to as lure, L-U-R-E, and which Harman calls allure, A-L-L-U-R-E. Another quote from Harman, this invites us into a world that seemed inaccessible, a world in which the object must be even deeper than what we had regarded as most intimate properties. It doesn't tell us the truth about a thing, but it lures us deeper into things. Now, Harman, writing this, is thinking primarily of weird fiction in the manner of H.P. Lovecraft, whose writing, Harman says, has an oblique or elusive relation with the reality that it can never access or describe directly. But science fiction operates according to a similar dynamic. The critic Brian Willems extends Harman's methodology in order to consider science fiction specifically. He writes about, quote from Willems, objects which resist incorporation into any past, present, or future scientific understanding. Willems explicitly contrasts his looking at science fiction from this point of view from the more common approach in which science fiction is taken to be about future events. But to my mind, Willems' opposition is unnecessary. For future events, no less than the withdrawn entities posited by Harman's object-oriented ontology, can it ever be grasped directly? As Whitehead puts it, once again, futurity is mere potentiality. It is only when an event actually happens in the present and then recedes into the past that it becomes a fully determined actuality. Futurity per se is not yet fully determined. This is why it can only be grasped speculatively, which is to say fictionally, elusively, and obliquely. Now the question of futurity thus brings us back to the other near double of speculative fiction, which is speculative finance. Economic activity necessarily has a temporal dimension. It takes time to produce goods, to distribute them, and to consume them. This is why a synchronic snapshot of the economy at one particular moment in time is always misleading. Debts and obligations persist over long stretches of time. This is already the case for human societies long before the invention of money or capitalism, and certainly long before the capitalist practice of calculating indebtedness exclusively in quantitative monetary terms. And I refer here to David Graeber's book about debt. Practices of specifically financial modes of speculation, however, which started in the ancient world in small forms, have steadily expanded over the course of the history of capitalism. Today, all economic activity, no matter how physically real or productive, is refracted through and largely governed by the abstract calculative mechanisms of financial speculation. The object of such speculation is always the future and its uncertainties and its differences from the present. Indeed, financial speculation used to be known as futures trading. My mother used to work for the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which regulated futures trading. The Clinton administration decided they would not be allowed to, or maybe actually it's actually the first Bush administration decided they would not be allowed to regulate these more arcane sort of financial instruments, and that led us directly down the path to 2008 financial crisis. Today, such speculation takes a wide variety of forms, ranging from straightforward loans and insurance contracts all the way to derivatives, credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, and other arcane financial instruments. I was just reading recently about a new form, collateralized loan obligations, which are slightly different from collateralized debt obligations. And they use this as an excuse that 2008 won't happen again, but it probably will. But anyway, it's worth remembering the monetary value of trade in these financial derivatives exceeds by many orders of magnitude the monetary value of the economic assets that ostensibly underlie them. Speculative financial instruments are themselves fictions of a sort, as they are contingent claims referring to future events that may or may not ever come to pass. Marx called such devices fictitious capital in Volume 3 of Capital. The term, however, is arguably still relevant today, when finance has taken far more baroque and extravagant forms than Marx ever imagined. And there's a recent book by Cédric Durand, a French economist, which talks about contemporary capitalism in terms of Marx's idea of fictitious capital. Needless to say, the fictionality of financial instruments does not mean that they are unreal or ineffective. Indeed, speculation can topple whole economies, as happened around the world in 2008. But even when these financial instruments calculate monetary value, but the point is that these things still are effective in the world. Even when these financial instruments calculate monetary value on the basis of entirely delusional presuppositions, as is all too often the case, they nonetheless have powerful pragmatic effects. It is all a matter of pricing potential future events and thereby binding the future to the present. As one financial journalist puts it, investors like risk as long as they can price it. They hate its uncertainty, not knowing how big the risk is. Speculative financial instruments claim to convert uncertainty into quantifiable risk. They do this both by calculating probabilities in the traditional manner and, more speculatively, by explicitly envisioning and pricing even the most extreme possibilities. So, the difference between probabilities and possibilities is an important one, which I don't get into in the introduction, but I will have to face later in the book. So, one is a kind of, the bell curve of probability. The other is sort of risk assessment post-2001 especially, which deals with extreme improbabilities, which are nonetheless, they try to take into account. And the point is, all these are monetized even though it's literally insane and there's no real basis for doing so. And the point is that in this way, the project of speculative finance is the inverse of, is one sense the inverse of speculative fiction, where science fiction seeks to multiply possibilities and open up alternative futures. Finance works to shut down the future by accounting for all possibilities in advance, by making them fully commensurate with the present, by giving them a price which can be traded upon in the present financial market. So in a certain sense, you could say that financial speculative finance and speculative fiction are uncanny doubles, inverted doubles, or mirror images of each other. As the critic Amy Bang puts in a recent book, this really takes kind of the form of an antinomy. She writes, although the future exists as absolute uncertainty, say in a metaphysical sense, nevertheless, in another quote, financial instruments work precisely toward actualizing the future in order to monetize and profit from it. By virtue of this antinomy, speculative fiction and speculative finance remain intimately intertwined. Okay, that's actually the limit of what I've been able to write out, so I'm just going to sort of conclude briefly by saying a few vaguer things. So the introduction would continue by talking about several examples of speculative fiction and how it relates inversely to speculative finance. And then the last part of the introduction would refer to the third and even more abstract or more abstracted or more distant term, which is fabulation. Fabulation is not that common a term in English. I know of two sources for it. One is the structuralist literary critic Robert Scholes, S-C-H-O-L-E-S, wrote a book called Speculative Fabulations in 1975, which was his account of science fiction. He had previously introduced the idea of fabulation as a more general way to talk about what were not then but are now called postmodern fictions. Speculative fabulation is SF, just like science fiction is SF, and that's he's played with that. So there's several people who have followed Scholes in thinking about fabulation in those terms. There's another usage of fabulation which comes from Henri Bergson and goes through Bergson to Gilles Deleuze, and has recently been picked up in science fiction discussions. There's a critic named James Burton who wrote a very interesting book a few years ago about fabulation in Bergson and then in Philip K. Dick. And so what I want to do is pick up on some of that stuff and together with the use of, we think of how way fabulation might be a distinct mode by which science fiction texts construct alternative realities. So that's a part I haven't really worked out yet. And I should mention it's difficult because, unfortunately, both in Bergson and Deleuze, the term fabulation in French is never translated as fabulation. It's translated as myth-making in Bergson, and it's translated as storytelling in Deleuze. If anybody's interested, give the references. But anyway, this is kind of bizarre, but it seems to be a useful term. And then, so I would end the introduction by talking a little bit about, fabulation, and then by kind of summing up and bringing to the structure of the book itself. And that's where I have these slides come in. I just give a very small, I'll just end with a very small discussion of what I'm trying to do generally. So I see science fiction as, the whole book I think of various antinomies which structure any attempt to think about these things. And again, this probably needs more explicit justification, but it's a term from Kant, and it's part of Kant that Hegel hated and tried to get rid of. And so my basic feeling, but I'm not a philosopher, so I can't really say this in any rigorous way, is that Hegel was wrong and Kant was right. Kant gives us these antinomies, which are oppositions which are either both true or both false, but we somehow can't get beyond it. Hegel invented dialectic precisely in order to get beyond it, but in fact we can't get beyond them. But anyway, so here's a thesis and antithesis. So there are thesis and antithesis, there's no synthesis. Not that Hegel really used the term thesis and synthesis, though it's often a way that dialectics is, but what Kant calls as transcendental dialectic does not have any synthesis, does not have any resolution. The thesis is that science fiction is anti-mimetic. It criticizes reality by departing from it and presenting what is unreal. Science fiction is canonically defined by Dr. Seuss, and I already quoted this, as the literature of cognitive estrangements. The antithesis is that science fiction operates fully within the realm of mimesis. The object of science fiction representation, while impossible to represent in a straightforward manner, are absolutely real. So these are the texts. The thesis of cognitive estrangements comes from Dr. Seuss's 1979 book, Metamorphoses of Science Fiction, which is pretty much the most canonical text in science fiction studies today to think about how we categorize science fiction. And I have a long quote here, which I won't read entirely, but SF is a genre whose necessary and sufficient conditions are the presence and interaction of estrangement and cognition, and his main formal device is an imaginative framework alternative to the author's empirical environment. He's basically taking Bertolt Brecht's aesthetics and saying that science fiction, even if SF authors don't have the explicit political aims Brecht does, are in fact doing a kind of Brechtian form of estrangement. And and that's, I guess, pretty much the standard view. The counter view to this comes from a wonderful book, which is all too little appreciated, Xiu-Young Chu's Do Metaphors Dream of Literal Sleep, which came out in about 2012, I think. I'm not sure of the exact date. And she sort of turns Seuss inside out. She says that, of course, science fiction, like any other narrative text, is mimetic and representational. However, what it does is it talks about things which are real but which are impossible to represent in a straightforward manner. So the future is, this is where I'm getting the idea. The future is real. There's certain things which you can represent fairly successfully, maybe never fully, obviously. There's always more to any reality than what we can say about it. But present existence can be represented with a greater degree of accuracy and completeness. Futurity is much more uncertain, so it's very hard to represent. So she's saying that science fiction is mimetic. It's mimetic of something, futurity, which is not susceptible to actual to complete representation. So she relocates the estrangement from the kind of formal level that Brecht and Seuss have it on to a different kind of way it functions narratively, which seems to me to be, I find this more fruitful and interesting, or it's definitely it's a way of thinking about, among other things, the social and political import of science fictional texts in a different way from how they've been conventionally done by Steuven, by Frederick Jameson, and most of my friends in the science fiction criticism community. So this is something which is behind what I read you in the introduction, which in the body of the book I'll pursue in much greater detail and depth. And then the book the notional structure of the book, which is always subject to change, is a first part would be just about the question of futurity, about how science fiction endeavors to represent futurity. What futurity is, how it's real, even if it's not actual, and what that might mean, and how science fiction works with it. The second part of the book would deal with speculative finance and its relation to speculative fiction. And this involves also a phenomenon, the fact that science fiction writers are actually getting paid to go to big corporations and develop scenarios for future planning. It also has to do with the fact that arguably the way that financial instruments work today are changing what it means to talk about the future in very radical ways. And this has to do obviously with the question of how science fiction has often been seen as, I think accurately but difficultly, as a way to try to think outside the parameters of contemporary society, or of what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism. The third part, which is much more sketchy, I want to talk about theories of rhythm and the way in which temporality is engaged in time-based arts, most obviously music, but also when I work on film and video as time-based arts, and how different notions of futurity are kind of formally thought about in these. And the fourth and final part, which is probably the most important one, is where I try to work all these ideas out in terms of actual mostly recent, though some older works of science fiction. And I kind of have a chart. Again, I'm thinking of these in terms of antinomies in a Kantian sense. And so these are just a series of pairs of antinomies, which it seems to me that contemporary science fiction is dealing with in various ways, together with other areas of contemporary social discourse. I'll say a little about a few of them. So envisionment of the future versus allegory of the present is a common antithesis in science fiction discussion. The second one, utopia, dystopia, is again a fairly obvious pairing, since science fiction works are very often taking both of these forms. In more concreteness, you might think of how might, from a kind of socialist or even just reformist perspective, how do we think about how technologies can be repurposed? And there's a tension between the prospect of technologies do things radically different versus the worry about ecological constraints and the need to tone down technology so we don't destroy ourselves. That might be thought of in more abstract speculative form in the humanities, versus currents of Prometheanism versus currents of what's been called in a volume, which I have an article in, the non-human turn. You might think of this also in science fictional terms as questions of escape from the Earth versus rededication to the Earth. Here I cite especially Kim Stanley Robinson's novel Aurora, which is a revisionist take on the space opera, multi-generational space, huge spaceship going to another, colonizing the world. Another ideological thing is accelerationism and degrowth as both strategies of thinking our ways out of capitalism. And the last one, perhaps the most interesting one for me, though I talked very little about it, is Afrofuturism and Afropessimism. So the terms are not exactly, Afrofuturism has been used to refer to science fiction and to mostly to Afro-diasporic works, not just of fiction, but also in other media, including especially music, where it probably comes first if you go back to Sun Ra in the 1950s, in which Afro-diasporic or African-American artists have thought about futurism, science fictional fantasies, and so on as a ways of getting out of the actual situation, and also think of the past in these terms. I mean, as Kojo Eshin puts it, there's a real sense in which the actual narrative by how most Africans came to the New World by being kidnapped, and basically it's an alien abduction story. These incredibly superior technologically but totally evil aliens, which look totally bizarre, show up, they take people, murder them, enslave them, put them in atrocious conditions, and take them to a totally new planet or a totally new world in which they're forced to perform the most horrible tasks. I mean, that's a science fiction narrative already. And Eshin argues that that's the way modernity is already described, in kind of the Afro-diasporic experience. I mean, it looks at all kinds of ways, for instance, to the argument which I buy that the only way to understand modern capitalism and its origins in Britain and Western Europe is to see that it's given a jump start by slavery. So as a number of historians have argued going back to Eric Williams in the 40s and more people recently, though slavery is regarded by Marxists as a pre-capitalist form of exploitation or power, nonetheless, capitalism as we know it could not have existed without the jump start it got by slavery on a very massive Atlantic-wide scale. Okay, so Afropessimism is not really a term applied to fiction or art.
but it's a recent, very interesting and problematic trend in African American studies and in, I think, critical thought currently. And this also goes back to the kind of enslavement of Africans and the absolute dehumanization of Africans, and basically sees a lot of our Western constructions, including liberal humanism, is so infected by these roots that it becomes an impossible bind. So both Afrofuturism, Afrofuturism is optimistic, you might say. It sees a future of liberation. Afropessimism is, as it says, pessimistic. It sees basically no hope aside from complete destruction of the world, basically. But they both start from the common assumption that all our definitions of the human are Eurocentric, white, normative, often also heterosexual, and so on, masculine, privileging definitions, and that rather than think that we can just expand the definition of humanity to include others who have been excluded from it, we somehow need to totally disrupt this definition. From the Afrofuturist side, this is worked out, I think, by Kojo Escher, who seems to be the most important critic in this mode, in terms of the tension between humanism and post or anti-humanism in Afro-diasporic music over the last 50, 60 years. But anyway, the play between Afrofuturism and Afropessimism seems to me to be a major tension which runs through some of the most important science fiction writers of recent years, especially through what I regard as the single most important book of the science fiction book of the last 10 or 15 years, which is N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy, which is 3 separate novels. The 5th season, The Stone Sky, The Obelisk Gate, and The Stone Sky, but which they're really one continuous novel that is broken for commercial reasons in 3 volumes, and which deals on a very deep level with all of these tensions. So all that stuff is what I hope to write about by the time I finish this book, which is a long distance away. So I'll stop for now and ask for questions.
Yeah. When you're talking about financial speculation, are you going to deal with the question of how cryptocurrencies are demythologizing the kind of fiction we have about money?
I'm not convinced they're demythologizing it, but yeah, that's part of the configuration which we're talking about here. I mean, I've been more focused in my reading on stuff about various forms of finance and debt, so how various kinds of bizarre speculative instruments work, and how debt rescheduling, intervenes in the lives of ordinary, non-wealthy people. But I think these are all interlocked. Obviously this is both a kind of exacerbated development of how capitalism works, and is greatly intertwined with the new electronic technologies, without which it would be totally impossible. So yeah, so that'll be included. I'm not sure to what extent or in what role, but yeah, that's definitely part of the picture. Yeah.
As a 19th century guy, I was thinking of how Prometheus Unbound is
yeah, sure. Well,
it's like a utopian. Well, it is utopian, but I mean, it has a sci-fi.
No, well, I mean, I think, yeah, I totally agree, and this is, my dissertation was partly on Percy Shelley. So I've abandoned romantic poetry for, I haven't done any academic work in over 30 years, but it's still something in the back of our mind, and, the obvious connection between Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley is important. And there's a way in which, one of the ways, in the larger romantic, one of the ways I try to talk about futurity as something which is real but not actual, which is a quote I get from several different thinkers, but it's also Shelley's language in the Defense of Poetry, where he talks about the poets are the mirrors of the inspiration that the unapprehended inspiration that the future projects upon the present. That's one version of what I'm talking about. And I think that if you look at Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley, it's the beginning of how the romantic imagination tends to be recoded in terms of technology and science.
Right.
Which part of what Frankenstein does is take all the themes of romantic imagination and apply them in terms of the beginnings of science, filthy workshop of creation. There wasn't just when industrial capitalism was starting, but that's what he's anticipating. So there's a whole theology of how, as John Reader talks about, Frankenstein becomes the first science fiction novel, even though it wasn't a science fiction novel in 1818 because science fiction didn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. antithesis, and also the rhetoric you're using of potentiality and
Yeah.
actuality. And
No,
that's,
yeah,
that's
totally.
real Shelleyan.
Well, it is, I know, I mean, it has a lot of, I'm getting it from various sources, including Whitehead and Deleuze and Bergson, including Bergson and Deleuze and Whitehead. But, I mean, that all has romantic roots, clearly.
Oh, just one last thing, about fabulation. Isn't there fabulation in psychoanalysis? I mean,
I'm sure there is, it's not,
I mean, I
yeah.
think it's when the patient is
Yeah, I think
making stuff up.
I'll probably have to think about that a little. I'm trying to avoid psychoanalysis, but for my own reasons.
How you're resisting it.
But I mean, yes.
Well, I was just a bit confused by the, your thesis and antithesis at the end.
Yeah.
The thesis is sci-fi is anti-mimetic, presents it's unreal, and then your antithesis was sci-fi is mimetic, and you presented it as like a problem or a challenge. You said you don't have a synthesis, but I heard you saying for the whole thing all along. What I heard was you supporting the antithesis.
That's true.
That it's about futurity. It's about what's real.
Yeah.
But so I mean, just a question. One, is that right? And second was just so the antithesis continued to kind of try to develop some kind of alternative to the thesis of cognitive estrangement, and said something instead like it's not that the well, said it's some things that could only be represented in an estranging way or something like that. Were you going to try to develop that then, or?
Well, that's what I'm trying. I mean, that is what I'm trying to. I mean, I found this book seems to be very important. So we'll go back to this. Go back to this slide. Okay, it's a neglected. It's a really important to my mind and a neglected book. Very few people in science fiction studies talk about it, but it seems it raises all kind of interesting possibilities for me. So yeah, I mean, I'm on. I guess I'm trying to be. I don't know if I'm playing with these antitheses. Obviously, I'm not giving them a rigorous philosophical account. I'm definitely on the antithesis side of this, but since 90% of what I read in science fiction theory and criticism, and most of my friends are on the other side, I can't just make it disappear. Is kind of what I'm thinking about. I mean,
it sounds fascinating.
Well, thank you. I mean, the same thing's true for the. The same thing's true for these other things. I mean, and many of them on more on one side than the other, but it seems to me the tensions are important and have to be dealt with without claiming to resolve them. Yeah.
I was intrigued by two things. First thing was like a comment was, in a sense, I mean, isn't all literature really about speculation, scientific or not? I mean, really about imagining things that we can't, and in a sense, predicting other realities. But the other thought I had was, I heard your talk, was how in a sense science fiction kind of reflects reality. I happened to see an ad today on Channel 7 this morning about one of the tire companies said it devised a way to have flying tires so they could, cars could fly, and I thought, wow, is that a science fiction idea? And on the other hand, it's very real. On the other hand, we're just starting to talk about cars that self-drive and so now there's somebody talking about putting cars in the air already.
Well,
and a tire company.
No, I can't. No, I totally agree with both of your points. I mean, again, that's why I started by spending so much time on how genre definitions are inexact, and there are always exceptions, and none of them will really stand up if you push them far enough. Because I'm finding it useful to talk about science fiction, which is a rough or approximative label, and to a certain extent, any imaginative work is doing this kind of stuff. I think science fiction accentuates certain aspects of it, which are the ones I'm most interested in looking at. So I'm going between the fact that I don't think you can, let's say, it's a problem in narrative and genre theory and film and literature. You can't really define or pin down genre in a rigorous enough way. And you can't really get very far if you don't use these terms, because but there's also a second dimension to that, which is that
in both film and literature, sometimes there's a kind of way in which, well, there's kind of way in which there's still prestige to certain types of works over than others. So some people in film will say that art films, the European art films, aren't really a genre the way crime films and science fiction films and westerns are genres. But of course, art film is the Euro art film is itself a kind of genre, or maybe several genres. The same thing comes up in science fiction. A lot of people, like in the science fiction communities, which I know about, I mean, we tend to really like Margaret Atwood's novels, like *Handmaid's Tale* and *Oryx and Crake* and things like that. But we also tend to be very pissed off because Margaret Atwood spends so much time saying, I'm not really doing science fiction. Science fiction is this gross, vulgar, stupid thing, and I'm doing something much more sophisticated, much more truly literary. And that kind of pisses people off in science fiction for good reasons. I mean, there's also a counterexample, which is Doris Lessing, who is a Nobel Prize winner for literature, who wrote all kinds of fiction, ranging from completely naturalistic fiction all the way to what she explicitly designated science fiction. Unlike Atwood, Lessing said, sure, of course my works are science fiction. What else could they be? And I think that's a better attitude, but it has to do with the fact that, I mean, it's like you keep on getting, when I went to graduate school in the 1970s, it was like, I could only do, there was a originally defined canon, and I could only do my dissertation on stuff in that canon. It was fine. I wrote about things I really enjoyed and liked, romantic poetry, but there were a lot of other things I was interested in, including science fiction, including, say, writers like William Burroughs, including also film, which I was already starting to work at, which wasn't yet accepted in the academy. And so you couldn't write a dissertation on it at Yale in 1981 when I got a PhD. So I mean, that's really changed. When I went to the University of Washington, there was no film studies program, and the reason was that the president of the university at the time was an old-fashioned guy who didn't think film studies was a valid academic subject. And there were lots of people who were waiting for him to retire so they could start a science fiction program. So start a film program, which was eventually started. This is why if you look around different universities, film programs are in different departments. Sometimes they're in departments, sometimes other different departments, and it all depends on sort of the history of how they were created. At the University of Washington, film studies is part of comparative literature because Professor Ernst Baylor, who for many years was the chair of Complit, was the biggest champion of trying to get film studies started and of waiting for the president to retire so he could actually make moves to make this happen. So, So there's all this thing. This is greatly diminished in contemporary academia, but it's still, I mean, just like a year ago, there was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education by the chair of an English department somewhere saying that, well, one of my faculty members came to me and wanted to do a course in Harry Potter, and I let her do it, but I really feel bad about this. It bothers me. Is Harry Potter really literature? Are we not destroying our standards by, I mean, this really seems ridiculous to me. I mean, obviously, I think some works are better than others. I don't think you can read and love literature or film or anything without making your own value judgment, which are better than worse. But to say, oh my God, we shouldn't have a Harry Potter course because it's not really the same kind of, I mean, it just seems ridiculous and rather sadly antiquated, and yet these things still come up in the discourse in the profession and in journals like the New York Review of Books, the London Books, et cetera, also. So, it's still there, even though it's much declined from what it used to be.
Yeah.
Okay. You're probably going to tell me there are 10 films I don't know about novels. That's good. But the term you didn't mention that you made me think at least was high-frequency trading.
Yeah.
Yeah, where all of this seems to be
No, that's,
colliding or
Yes.
short-circuiting, but
Yes.
maybe in a weird way on the
no, I
speculative
mean, as I said,
finance
there's a
side
lot,
of
I'm
things.
trying to only refer to it, in that introduction, I'm trying to only refer to it briefly, but there's so much going on which is worthy of studying, which I think actually resonates with the concerns, both with the thematic and content concerns of science fiction and with the question of what the future means and what the speculation means today. So just as Arthur was asking about cryptocurrency, so you're asking about high-frequency, all that is totally relevant. I mean, to get back to
what should I be reading, seeing?
Yeah, to get back to a previous question, comment about the tire advertisement. I mean, it's sort of that. Well, I start at the very beginning of my talk. I quoted Donna Haraway's statement that the boundary line between science fiction and social reality is increasingly an optical illusion, and she wrote that in 1982, and it seems remarkably prescient because if you read that whole article, her Manifesto of Cyborgs in 1982. It actually, I mean, it doesn't seem antiquated at all. She's talking about cultural and social and technological and financial developments which are much more intensive now than they were when she was writing. It's one of those rare works
academic writing, which, I mean, I have almost no hope that something right now will be still valid 40 years from now, but that's a piece of academic writing that really, that really is. And also flying cars. I mean, flying cars are a kind of trope of old-fashioned science fiction. I mean, one thing, again, I didn't talk about here, which is also related, is the pattern of futures which have already seen, which are in the past. So you read 50s science fiction or look at 50s science fiction illustrations, and you see things which are much beyond our technological capability, but which also seem completely hokey and old-fashioned. And flying cars is one of the quintessential examples of that. You know, so William Gibson, the author of Neuromancer in 1984, who basically invented the term cyberspace and really imagined the internet ahead, and a lot of people, engineers who were making the internet, were fans of the novel and were taking Gibson's dystopian vision as a positive blueprint. Quite ironic, but Gibson said in interviews to chagrin that he imagined all this stuff, but right in the 1980s, he had no clue that there would ever be something like mobile phones. It didn't even cross his mind. There's nothing in it. He assumes that even to get this magical cyberspace where you have instantaneous connection everywhere, he assumed that you'd have to go to a physical location to plug into it. So, that's why, that's something which is, there is futurity in that novel, but he didn't predict this future thing. So, I mean, the science fiction things like flying cars, which were promised us 50, 70 years ago, don't exist, still don't exist, and probably won't for various reasons, but in a certain sense, having the internet and having the communications in our pocket. I always tell my students that the phone they have in their pocket is far more powerful than the most advanced computer in 1958, which would have filled an entire room, 3 rooms of this size. So. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.